If war is the continuation of politics by other means, as Mr. Clausewitz once told us, then logically politics is also the continuation of war by other means. Is the United States currently trying to switch back from one to the other in its proxy war in Ukraine through the 28-point peace plan? Here to discuss this with me is Anatol Lieven, the director of the Eurasia Program and the Andrew Bacevich Chair in American Diplomatic History at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Anatol, welcome back.
Hello. Nice to be back.
Thanks for coming online. I would really like to pick your brain on where you think this is going, especially if the United States and the Trump team is serious about, the 28 points, even though, the Russians have signaled so far that they're willing to entertain the thought. It might be good in certain respects, not in others, but they're willing to go along. The Europeans are now trying to sabotage it. But first of all, do you think that this is a new approach by the U.S. administration to approach like the European theater?
Well, I think it is by part of the Trump administration. Witkoff certainly seems to have thrown his weight behind this, as has J.D. Vance. But it's not nearly as clear that Rubio, the Secretary of State, is behind it. And of course, there's this tremendous ambiguity and doubt and confusion about what he actually said to the senators when he met them about it. And of course, we know that Kellogg is against it. And indeed, Kellogg is basically, I think, resigning over this. So it would appear that there are deep divisions within the Trump administration. But I don't think that there's any doubt that Trump, in principle, wants to get this war finished. And I mean, what is new about this is that, only last month, I was told both by Russian officials and by American officials that the negotiating teams had still not engaged in detail with many of these concrete issues. Well, now they have. They haven't nailed down completely some of the issues, but actually, all the key issues are addressed in this 28-point plan. And the European response seems to me very strange, frankly, and does raise, well, the thing is that as far as I can see, there is only one aspect of the 28-point plan that is really, really difficult for the Ukrainians. And I've always said it is very difficult, and I can understand their objections. And that is the call for withdrawal from the whole of the Donbass, because, it seems that actually, if you read the BBC, a good many Ukrainian soldiers are now prepared to give it up because they don't want to die for somewhere that they think they're bound to lose anyway. But, on the other hand, people who've fought and suffered for so long to keep this slice of land, you understand why they don't want to abandon it. Although, of course, in the 28-point plan, this territory is going to be demilitarized. So it's not a question of the Russian army moving forward to take it over. So, from the security point of view, Ukraine will have protection, but it will come under Russian administration. Now, this is only 1% of Ukraine, of the whole of Ukraine. It's largely depopulated anyway. If the war goes on and Russia closes in on Kramatorsk, then the whole place will be depopulated. So, in a rational world, this shouldn't be so difficult, but it is difficult. But there are other things in the European and Ukrainian response, their 19-point plan, or whatever it is, I'm getting my plans confused by now, which seem very strange. One of them is this demand that the Ukrainian army be capped at 800,000 men rather than the 600,000, in the initial draft. Because firstly, in Istanbul at the top of the war, at the start of the war, the Ukrainians were ready to agree to 250,000 as the cap. But also, even 600,000 is as much as the British, the French, and the German armies, the current ones, put together. There's no way that Ukraine can sustain an army of even 600,000 men in peacetime. I mean, you have, of course, reserves, conscripts, who then you recall to the service. But, they will never have the money to sustain that size of peacetime army. And similarly, I mean, keeping NATO membership open, they must know by now they're never going to get into NATO. I mean, it's obviously a matter of pride and a face-saving thing, but for both sides. But it does, I mean, and the European reassurance force, which even the British have admitted now they're not going to send ground troops, because they don't have any ground troops. So, I mean, there are two ways of reading this. One, the optimistic version would be that they don't take these seriously and they're putting them down as bargaining counters so that they can then say, all right, we'll no longer insist on this, we'll no longer insist on that, but the Russians have to give up the demand for the whole of the Donbass. Now, that would be the optimistic version. The pessimistic version is that this is a deliberate attempt at sabotage, at wrecking the peace process. I'm not sure, frankly. I mean, if it is a deliberate attempt at wrecking the peace process, then this is, I mean, truly malevolent, because there is, frankly, no chance whatsoever, none, that the deal that Ukraine will get a year down the line, I mean, possibly it will be able to hang on to a bit of the Donbass, but everything else the Russians are not going to compromise on.
Much worse.
Exactly. I mean, and the Ukrainians and Europeans will be risking a complete Ukrainian collapse if this war goes on.
Yeah, and the Russians already said, look, it's thinkable to go to Odessa, right, and connect what they have to all the way up to Transnistria. So, I mean, I think that's actually on the cards of one of the potential futures.
Well, if the Ukrainian army collapses completely, but it would have to collapse completely, because remember, the Russians have got to get across the Dnieper River, which is not easy. But certainly one could imagine them capturing Zaporizhia. And a whole swathe of Kharkov, and then trying to exchange it. And we can't say that for sure. Obviously, the Russian advance over the past year has been extremely slow, grindingly slow. But then, there is so much evidence now of enormous Ukrainian difficulties. But also, so much will depend on who Trump blames for the collapse of this peace process, if it does collapse. Because, if he blames the Russians, then, pressure continues, sanctions continue, US arms sales continue, intelligence provision continues. But if he blames the Ukrainians and the Europeans, then, of course, he could cut off the arms sales and he could cut off the intelligence. And then the Ukrainians would be in a really desperate situation.
Yeah, that's the real question to me. Would he do that? Because if the United States basically really pulls out, including the intelligence sharing, including the satellites and so on, the Ukrainians would be basically blind, and there's nothing Europe can do to change that, right? So in a sense, and I've discussed this earlier in another talk with Michael Rossi, if it is Russia and the United States coming to an agreement, would they even need Ukraine to sign off on that, or would they need Europe? I mean, if they agree and actually they make a framework and stick to that framework, how could the Ukrainians wreck it other than little shooting at a couple of soldiers here and there, where then in the end defense will be?
Well, I mean, the thing is that this is where so in so many ways most Western reporting and analysis has been so shamefully bad, because of course there are a whole range of things that is portrayed as being, Ukraine must have the final say. This is Ukraine's decision, which aren't.
No.
NATO membership is not a matter for Ukraine.
No.
European or Western forces in Ukraine are not a matter for Ukraine. Arms provision, arms sales are not a matter for Ukraine. These are matters for Western governments and above all the United States. But of course, to get the Ukrainian army would have to withdraw from the rest of the Donbass. That is for Ukraine to decide. Well, it's very interesting. The Russians have gone further in this initial draft than I expected on some things. I mean, one of them is I didn't think that they would be willing to leave the question of Russian rights in Ukraine up to the European Union accession process, because after what happened to the Russian minorities in the Baltic states, all the Russians I talked to said we can't trust the European Union an inch on that. But in the initial draft, that was what it was. It was, I mean, but there were also going to be certain commitments from Ukraine, but very vague ones.
Although we don't know in the initial draft what was actually cleared with the Russians and what not. I mean, that might be just. I mean, it's one they ping pong it back and forth or whatnot, and we don't know what was inserted at which point and what was agreed on and whatnot.
That's true. Yeah, but still, I mean, the Russians have backed that draft in principle, not the latest European one. I mean, they haven't committed themselves absolutely to it, but Putin said that, in essence, this is acceptable. Wait, there was something else as well, which was quite. Oh yes, that sanctions will only be lifted in stages, and there's no timetable. And this, I had always assumed that the Russians were going to insist on the suspension of sanctions as part of the peace deal. And then, of course, when it comes to the initial deal on Russia's assets being used for the reconstruction of Ukraine, I mean, I was told in Moscow that actually Russia would accept that, as long as this is not in any way phrased in terms of reparations, that this is Russia's decision basically to give this money for the reconstruction of Ukraine, and it is shared between the areas under the Ukrainian government and the areas under Russian occupation. And then people differed. Some said, it'd have to be 50-50. Others said, no, we could accept it 20-80, since we know it's very, otherwise, we risk losing this money altogether. But the European and Ukrainian counter proposal is totally unacceptable to the Russians. So,
yeah, I mean, I didn't actually expect anything else to come out of Europe, to be honest, because it seems to me that they really prefer to continue the bleeding out of Ukraine if it means not losing face right now, rather down the road, maybe when some of these governments are actually not governing anymore, right? And they can say, I did all I could, and the next guy, he screwed it up. The bigger question.
Well, that's it. You're right. I mean, if they can, if the French government can keep this going another 18 months, then most likely there will be a Le Pen government, a Rassemblement National government in France, and then they can blame the Ukrainian collapse on them. But they're running
out of time.
Well, yeah.
I mean, 18 months. That's that's a long stretch. Just something else. I think one of the most pessimistic, but simultaneously important interpretations of what is going on is coming from a contributor, Brian Berletic, on the New Atlas, and he keeps saying tirelessly, making the argument, a very cogent argument, that whenever the United States hits a brick wall, what it does is it doesn't swing into peace mode. It just swings into something that looks like peace in order to reload, withdraw, reload, and then attack another day. And he keeps making the argument, look, we had the moment when Hillary Hillary Clinton and Lavrov even literally pressed the reset button and were all smiles, just in order then for this Minsk process to kick in, and later on the Europeans telling us, look, it was always meant to just buy us time to weaponize Ukraine against Russia. So what if the current thing is actually the same? It's meant to just buy a little bit more time in order to regroup and work on both fronts, right? The Asian one with China and the European one with Russia. And isn't this something that would be going through the minds of Russia, which I think by now clearly understood over the last 20 years that there is continuous continuing onslaught coming at them? What do you make out of that argument?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is that there are, as I said, deep divisions, not just in Washington, but within the Trump administration, because, we know that there are people in the administration, who genuinely want peace with Russia so as to concentrate on China, Elbridge Colby, for example. But there's considerable evidence to suggest that J.D. Vance is part of that as well. And Trump, of course, has gone to and fro. But I mean, there's no doubt that Trump in principle wants peace. He doesn't. I don't think there's any evidence that he actually wants this war to go on, and he would like to take responsibility for a peace settlement. But of course, you're right. I mean, we know others who, are still so much of the U.S. media is still, determined to try to keep this war going, and are hoping to weaken Russia still further. But I don't think it's settled yet. And of course, there is also the point that to go further, much further than they have gone already in attacking Russia economically, you do perhaps have to actually start seizing Russian cargoes on the high seas. Now, that is blockade. Now, that is an act of war. And the Russians have threatened that at that point they have no choice but to hit back militarily in some way. And, in the end, the Pentagon also, I mean, of course, there are these lunatic ex-generals like Breedlove and Hodges, but the last thing the Pentagon wants is to be drawn into a war in Europe with, given what's happening with China. So I think, I don't think that this is all a cynical plot on the part of the Trump administration as a whole, no. But I mean, I think a bigger problem, which of course the Russians talk about all the time, is that, as so many people have around the world, that no agreement with the US now can be trusted beyond 4 years. Because if the Democrats win in 28, or even perhaps if Rubio wins, as we saw under Trump, a new US president can simply tear up treaties. I mean, the old principle of pacta sunt servanda has long since gone out of the window. That if one government makes a treaty, this is not just the government, it is the country that has made the treaty. The country's name and credibility are involved, and therefore the treaty must be respected. Nobody believes that anymore. So, yeah, I mean, it's no good. It's a ridiculous line that there is no consensus at the moment for further NATO enlargement, and you expect the Russians to accept that. I mean, there was no consensus for NATO enlargement in 2007, but I mean, the Germans and French went along with it. So
no, it's. I mean, Russia would be foolish to actually believe that a signature on a piece of paper would guarantee any kind of future peace, right? So the only thing that would actually matter are verifiable and monitorable processes, right? Something like, and I think Russia and the United States actually have a good experience on that. The decommissioning of some of these nuclear weapons, right? The nuclear weapons treaties, where you then send observers to each other states and they record everything. I mean, that type of agreement, I think, is something that you could realistically work with. Just within this 28 points and so on, there's nothing that will give a hint at anything that will create a verifiable process, is there?
Well, there's talk of arms, negotiations on arms limitations. The Trump administration is actually reducing its military presence in Romania.
Right.
It's interesting that the 28-point agreement talks of NATO air power in Poland, interestingly. But you could read that as saying, therefore, there won't be NATO ground forces, or at least there won't be US ground forces.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think, it's very clear that Putin and a majority of the Russian establishment do see real possibilities here in terms of a new relationship with the US. Look, on the one hand, if the Democrats or Rubio win in 28, then yes, I mean, this whole agreement could be in danger. But if Vance wins, it could stick and then form the basis of something else. Whereas, if the Russians reject it outright now and alienate and humiliate Trump, well, then, they're throwing away that possibility for the future.
True.
So I think there is something here for the Russians to play for. The other thing, of course, is that, if they can, by stopping this war now, if they get basically what they feel they have to get, then, of course, the next question that immediately emerges, European Union membership for Ukraine. Now, then you find the Europeans really, really in difficulties. All these promises that they basically cannot keep, or at least not without totally transforming the European Union. And then, of course, you also have political change in Western Europe, new governments perhaps, which are categorically opposed to this anyway. And so there is, there is also an argument for Russia to make peace now.
Yeah, no, there definitely is, and I mean, it does hurt Russia. That's for sure that this is going on. But then again, there's so many dangers ahead, right? On the one hand, yes, Russia for the longest time has said European Union membership for Ukraine is not out of the question, right? Because especially when the European Union was clearly this economic club, although recently that's not that clear anymore. But by now, shouldn't there be a fear on the mind of the Russians that if that happens, instead of seeing the Europeanization of Ukraine, we might see the Ukrainization of Europe? Because the extremist element within Ukraine, I mean, having them then interact, like look at what Sikorski did with Poland and so on within the European Union, how they managed to capture a lot of the process. Isn't that something that should worry Russia?
Well, I think it does, but I think that there is a very widespread, certainly I've been told by at least one Russian informant, that the assumption is that one of two things will happen, both to the advantage of Russia. Either the European Union, after all these promises, does not take Ukraine in, even in second-class status. Because you know what the acquis communautaire is like. You've got to sign up to a whole set of detailed things which the Ukrainians cannot possibly meet for a very long time to come. And then, if the European Union doesn't let the Ukrainians in, you will have a tremendous mood of betrayal and anger and disappointment in Ukraine, which will work in the long term to the advantage of Russia. And the Russians point to Turkey, which has become much more favorable to Russia, not really because it favors Russia, but because it has, well, it's different because then, of course, Turkey has all its problems with the US because of Israel and the Iraq war and the Kurds. But, obviously, the refusal of the European Union to admit Turkey also played a critical part in this alienation of Turkey from the Western alliance. Or they think the European Union will tear up all its rules to let Ukraine in, and this will basically destroy the European Union from within. So, whichever way Russia wins.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, the thing is, nobody knows what next idea will come after the European Union, and I think Russia's experience over history has been that if there's one thing you can count on, is that you can't count on Europe.
Well, yes, but then, I mean, at that point, I mean, that's simply a mirror image of what the Europeans say about Russia, that you can never trust Russia. Russia is always aggressive. Russia is always imperialist. I mean, at that point, there's no point in seeking agreement at all. You have to seek complete victory. Well,
yeah,
Russia isn't going to win a complete victory over the West. It just does not have the men or the resources to do that.
Which it brings us, everything you pointed out brings me back to this question and to this a very brilliant essay that you wrote and that I will never forget. And you wrote it in very early April 2022. It was called "The Nature of Future Ukrainian Neutrality," or like the neutrality of Ukraine, the future neutrality of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And you laid out in what sense we were going back then through the Istanbul peace process, and it all looked very good, and it looked like Ukraine finally understood, okay, if I remain neutral and be a buffer state, then I can maintain even the Donbass and my sovereign integrity and play a constructive role. Zelensky even said so much, and that all of that was torpedoed and so on. But it now looks as if though the forces actually, also what you laid out with the European Union never living up to these promises, with the NATO membership never coming there. At some point, even the nationalists, even the ultra right-wing elements within Ukraine must understand that they must seek some form of independent role and not as an appendix to this or that institution or to Russia, right? Do you think that within Ukraine at some point this realization will come up within the militarists and the right wing that, okay, look, the best thing we could do is do it on our own?
Well, I mean, I think what the Russians are hoping for, I mean, the sensible Russians, the moderate Russians, not, the real extremists who still do dream of subjugating the whole of Ukraine, is in the long run something like Georgia, whereby you actually do get a nationalism, or in Hungary, or even in a way in Poland, except the Poles, of course, are so hostile to Russia that it doesn't work in the same way. But basically saying, look, we are for ourselves. Italia farà da sé. And that means, we are not going to become subordinate to Russia, but we are also not going to allow ourselves to be played with, and dictated to by the West or the European Union. Of course, it's going to be different in Ukraine because, obviously, the Georgian war didn't last very long. This war has lasted for almost 4 years, and so many people have been killed. But, the thing is, of course, about the Ukrainian ethnic nationalists, like the Hungarians or the Poles or the Georgians, they are not attached to what the European Union now calls European values, which of course are the European values of, the European liberal elites over the past 10 years. I mean, they're not, they have no deeper historical basis than that. And then, the European Union, once again, I mean, unless it's going to basically tear up the acquis, is going to be asking for things which the Ukrainian right will find very, very offensive. And, I don't know, the EU has turned a blind eye to so many things, but the point is that when you actually start thinking seriously about EU membership, then everybody who is against EU membership for their own economic reasons, the farmers, in so many countries, the truckers, will really start looking at Azov, and Svoboda and Bieletsky and this whole, and say, no, we cannot have, Ukraine with these people in the European Union. Ukraine must do something to suppress them. Well, these people are very heavily armed. And by now,
yeah, by your own side, yeah.
So no, I mean, yeah, but this is it. We've been lying for so long. We lied in 2007 and from then on that we were going to bring Ukraine into the European Union, because we never had the slightest intention of fighting to defend Ukraine, or making a real security commitment to Ukraine. Then, of course, the European Union lied in 2013, this association agreement. You talk to people in Europe then, and they never had the slightest. This was not a path to membership. This was introduced by the Poles and the Balts and the Swedes to block closer economic relations with Russia. It was a purely negative thing. There was no money in it for the Ukrainians. It was, it was deliberate sabotage. There was no intention of bringing the Ukrainians in. But now, of course, we're trapped by our own lies. I mean, in another and better world, Rutte and, God, I've forgotten his name already, that Stoltenberg and, all the others who said, future NATO membership is irreversible and so forth, should resign. They should say, I mean, they could even say, I was committed to this, but it's clear that this is not going to happen. Therefore, I step back. I give up my. But of course, they're never going to say that. But you've got all these governments, who did say that, who are now, in a way, stuck with it. And, well, I mean, in the end, if the Trump administration really cracks the whip, they will have to give this up. But we are going to see in the next few days just how far that will be the case.
Yeah, no, the question though is, at least for the Europeans, we've seen how so many times they were willing to walk things back or to just forget that they once were said, right? I mean, the NATO General Secretary is a prime example, right? Who one day he says the path of Ukraine toward NATO is irreversible, and the next day he says, oh, we never promised membership. That we never said they would be. We always said we would walk to. I mean, it's so.
I know. Well, I think I mean, my hope is that these will be given up, because actually, they're meaningless to a great extent, this kind of thing. But for me, the real difficulty is this question of Ukrainian military withdrawal from the rest of the Donbass.
That is true.
Because that is genuinely very difficult. You will see, I mean, I think you will see a lot of Ukrainian soldiers who would be happy to do that in return for peace, but undoubtedly you will see a lot of others who will say, no, we fought too hard for this. We must keep it. And also they have been, and Westerners too have been souped up on this idea that these so-called fortress towns are critical to the Ukraine's defense, and you have all this parallel to the Sudetenland in 1938. But of course, the point is, this is a very small part of the Ukrainian front. And actually, the Russians have made equally slow progress elsewhere, which are not, built up and fortified areas. It's just, open countryside. When it comes to drones, in some ways, the open countryside is worse because it's open. It's very difficult to advance across open fields. It's easier to do it, actually, from within, within urban areas. We see now with this Russian infiltration into Pokrovsk. But, once you've had this line hammered into you, I mean, I was surprised to find, people, Westerners who I thought were well informed, who were also saying, "Oh, but these towns are absolutely critical to Ukraine's defense." And I said, "But hang on, the Russians will not advance. We can help the Ukrainians to build a new line of defense, which after all is what they've been doing so far. They've fallen back from one line to another. I mean, this in itself is another meaningless argument. But the political point about the difficulty of giving this up, that's real and hard."
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's why the 28-point peace plan tries to frame it as it will become no man's land, right? A buffer zone. And so the Russians will also commit to not going in there in order to make that somehow more digestible, right? But the role now of the Europeans, again, is like this, I think, is one of sabotage. But maybe let's focus on one more thing, which is the things that we don't see, the things that are not happening. And one of the things that I find interesting in terms of, NATO and US troops stationing, I think you already said, right, there's a couple of troops being removed out of Romania at the moment. The United States has, since last year, bilateral agreements with Sweden and Finland to build new bases, 17 and 15 respectively. I forgot which one where. But except for one single base in Finland, as far as I know, the US didn't start actually putting personnel there. So they're holding off, although they now have the legal framework that would even allow them to put any weapons that they choose, which would include nuclear weapons, on that territory. They're not doing that. Is that the things that are not happening? Does that also signal us something about this understanding between Moscow and Washington that is maybe appearing around us?
I think so, because we know that the Trump administration, in principle, wants to draw down U.S. military commitments in Europe. I mean, once again, not all the Trump administration, but there are these elements. But it makes good sense to put forward a bargaining counter, but actually not to confirm it and then to be willing to negotiate over it. So I think, in principle, now that the Trump administration appears to be finally able to negotiate things in detail, which for months it wasn't, if you can, get over this Ukrainian and European blocking attempts, I would be modestly hopeful that the US and Russia could actually pursue a disarmament process. I mean, some of it is actually pretty obvious, to be honest. I mean, the problem is, of course, that the previous agreements were good agreements, and then, with fault on both sides, but broke down. And I would say fault starting with the United States. I mean, the abandonment of the ABM treaty was what really started unraveling everything, and the refusal to ratify the CFE treaty. But you can begin something absolutely obvious. The Americans do not deploy these intermediate range missiles in Germany, and Russia pulls them out of Kaliningrad and Belarus. That's should be pretty open and shut. The US commits not to put ground troops, in Poland and Romania or in the Baltic, and Russia promises to limit its troops in Belarus to, well, basically what it is now, which is an insignificant force in terms of numbers. I think, that but it does depend. I mean, the guy in the Trump administration who's really been pushing this most of all is Elbridge Colby, who's the Deputy Secretary of Defense. He just got confirmed by the Senate. But his two deputies, the latest news is they are most likely to be blocked by the Senate. as part of this whole, pushback against Colby. And, so there are tremendous things, going on under the surface.
Can you help me with Albrecht Colby? He's on which side? He's on the de-escalatory side?
No, Colby wants to concentrate on China. He wants to draw down commitment to Europe. But I mean, the thing is, Colby also
is a hawk on China.
He's a hawk on China, but he also opposed the US attack on Iran, and he supported the JCPOA. So he's got two big lobbies against him, and they are determined to get it, basically.
So there's still, I mean, since you are in a think tank in Washington and you interact there, is there some sort of lack of better word, this internal civil war about who to engage next? Is that one raging in Washington? Because there's also Venezuela that is kind of just sitting there on pause. There's also still Iran, right? And I mean, Israel, I don't know what they're scheming right now, but they must be scheming something. So there's these different theaters that could at any time blow up. The one that is kind of silent at the moment is the China front, although the Japanese and the Chinese have a spat, but I think that one is a little bit removed, separate from the American one.
Yeah, well, I mean, Rubio, I mean, obviously the hope must be that, well, not exactly a hope, not if you're Venezuelan, or Colombian or whatever, but that Rubio is so personally focused on Venezuela and Central America and Cuba, that actually he too wants to get this war in Ukraine over with so he can concentrate on what really, emotionally interests him most. The Israelis, I've always been surprised that they haven't tried harder for, to try to defend good relations with Russia. Because obviously, I mean, this is a great distraction of US attention from the Middle East. But of course, especially since the latest, Israeli successes, I mean, I think they're in a mood that they don't really need anybody and can do whatever they like. But yeah, I mean, Washington is very divided at the moment. But if you look at the response in Congress, with some exceptions, a few more exceptions than in the past, but still, certainly among the Democrats, but so many Republicans as well, I mean, are pathologically opposed to peace with Russia and to this peace settlement. And of course, well, I heard, you see, that one of the reasons that the Russians have accepted the idea of sanctions being, ended in stages is because actually they know that there's no chance of the US Senate voting for immediate sanctions relief in any case. So, in a way, Russia loses nothing by.
Why make it a sticking point if it's not really
going to get it anyway? Exactly.
So this complicates the matter, of course, plus that the people must be starting now to scheme already for the next 2.5 years, right? I mean, the midterms are only a year away, less than a year, right? And we see the power struggle within also the Republican Party, where MAGA seems to be splitting, and we have this very bizarre, a very interesting decision by Marjorie Taylor Greene, basically one of the spiritual leader of the non-interventionist arm of the Republicans, just like quitting on the, like saying 6th of January is my last day. What do you make out of that one?
Well, I mean, there are, if you like, the real MAGA types, who are bitterly opposed to the Washington establishment, who are also, of course, to some extent, genuinely economically populist, at least in their basic instincts. And, promise their base all sorts of things, which they're not getting. I mean, Epstein was only the the last straw from that point of view, because before that there was the attack on Iran, which they really disliked, and that wing of MAGA didn't like the big beautiful bill as well. They haven't really come out against it, but they don't like these tax cuts for the rich. They don't like the rich, basically. The thing is that if it wasn't for the first past the post system, the Republican Party would long since have disintegrated into at least two parties or three, and so would the Democrats, by the way. They're both have such incompatible elements within them, and of course that makes predicting the future
even harder.
Well, because after all, Trump did himself terrible damage by resisting the release of the Epstein files, drove Taylor Greene into revolt, and so forth and so on. But now he's actually agreed to it in the hope, it seems, which is partially fulfilled already, only partially, that it will be even more embarrassing to the Democrats. But it's hard to understand why he didn't do it earlier. But then, it's true. Everyone says this is a very, uncontrolled and impulsive individual. But this is going to be a huge problem, I think, for Vance in 2028, because he's going to face the question asked to Kamala Harris. Look, you're saying all this now, but you've been vice president for 4 years. Why weren't you saying it before? Why, now you say you're economic populist, but you supported this big, beautiful bill. And then, of course, if the economy has gone down and if inflation continues to go up, I almost feel that Vance might do better not to stand for president in 28 and then try and come back as a real populist, do a Trump at some stage in future, because the way things are going, there is a genuine big populist upsurge in America, as there is in Europe, and as we see, and sometimes, as you well know, in this with Bernie Sanders, but again with Mamdani, a good many of the voters who voted for Mamdani had previously voted for Trump in the presidential election, because basically they're just utterly fed up with the existing establishment, and they will vote for anybody who they think is going to take a hammer to the establishment.
If we take all of this into consideration, like this internal turmoil inside the United States, what do you think does this do to the Russian negotiation strategy of where to get to? It's again, like, we're at the point where we say, like, even if they come up with something they can sign, there's no realistic way to believe that stuff will be implemented the way it is agreed on. So what do you think the Russians are calculating in order to hedge their bets or to create something that they can work with down the road?
Well, my sense is that I could be wrong, but I was told in Moscow that Putin has to get hold of the Donbass. That is the least with which he can then genuinely present this as a victory.
Yeah.
Because, don't forget that given Russian history and given what Russia hoped for at the start of this war, this has been a disaster for Russia in so many ways. And also, of course, the war was abominably planned. Now, people in Russia try to avoid, even in private on the whole, criticizing Putin, but the number of people who've said to me that Gerasimov and Shoigu ought to be shot for planning this war so badly, which they did. The invasion was a disaster. It was an intelligence disaster. It was a planning disaster. And then, of course, Putin is also vulnerable And this is where, of course, the Western reporting is so shameful, once again, shamefully bad, because Putin is vulnerable to attacks by the right for having trusted the French and the Germans.
Yes.
And he himself has admitted that. I trusted the Europeans
To live
too
up
far.
to your words, yeah.
So he can't, there is an irreducible minimum. And I think, what I was told was neutrality, that, no NATO membership cannot be given up by the Russians. They just can't. And the whole of the Donbass, perhaps, as well. But I think my sense is, they are clearly very anxious to try to keep in with Trump. And no doubt Vance in future. They really don't want to break with him or alienate him. And then, if they can get a moderately an agreement that meets their basic conditions, there is a strong argument then for basically sitting back and waiting to see if, in fact, if Rassemblement National wins in France, EU membership for Ukraine is almost certainly dead in any case, And I really don't see Bardella, pushing for a new aggressive policy against Russia.
Yeah.
And, you can hope then that if Vance wins in 28, you have a very different configuration in the West, because then you actually have an alignment between France, the United States, Britain, if Farage wins in Britain. And then, of course, German politics begin to look very interesting. So, obviously Russia has survived very well so far economically. But, there are grave concerns. Living standards are suffering. Prices are rising. And after all, they're paying enormous amounts to this volunteer army. There's not much point in doing that if it's if these wages are immediately eroded by inflation. So, there are also good economic reasons for trying to bring this to an end.
Yeah. Okay. So in a sense, all there on all sides, you're actually seeing reasons why this should be, or why winding it down should be more and more in the interest of the different parties. But on the other hand, the way these forces are distributed at the moment will create something questionable at best, right? Of how long it will hold. It will not be, whatever it will be, it will not be a 1945 type of, clear cut end to this.
No, because, that's the absurd thing on the Western side. Idiot Callas and company, the things that they were hoping for, you could only achieve if NATO marched into Moscow, to take the peace. Well, ridiculous. But equally, well, Russia, I don't think, can march into Ukraine, into Kiev, and actually it would be a grave mistake if it did, because it would then have to run the place as opposed to,
push it away,
keeping it a certain distance and then watching perhaps Ukraine collapse internally. But also, when it comes to the real hardliners who say, we can't trust the West at all, we must somehow defeat or crush the West. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean the Russian army marching into Paris like in 1814, or marching into Berlin as in 1945? No, that can't happen. So, and also, of course, there is an ambiguity here when it comes to the Eurasianists and people like Karaganov, who say Russia should really reorient towards Asia, break with Europe and so forth. Well, at that point, sure, but at that point, you actually do want to try to pacify this, and not surrender, but you want to extricate yourself from this Ukrainian mess. If Europe is not the future and is not really important, and if economic growth and the future center of the world is in Asia, then you don't want to wreck this for the sake of a few ruined towns in eastern Ukraine. No, you actually want to achieve your minimum and then try and
a proper border, and then let it rot on the other side, whatever it's gonna be. Well, Anatol, I stole an entire hour of your time. Thank you very much for that. People
As always.
people want to read more from you, they should go to Responsible Statecraft. Is there any other place where you publish sometimes?
Unheard. I write a lot for Unheard site, and I'm hoping that there will be a piece with me in Time magazine in the next couple of days as well on this. So, writing away.
That will be wonderful. I will put the links into the description box below. Anatol Lieven, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks a lot, Pascal. Till soon.